and welcome to Mysterious Events. I'm your host, Stephen A. Mackay, a writer and podcaster with a lifelong interest in the strange and unexplained. On today's episode, I thought I'd take a look at some places and events that are close to home for me here in Scotland. I've lived and worked in and around Dumbarton for most of my life, and it's generally a really nice area. There's great scenery with the hills, trees and rivers that Scotland is famous for. There's also a very long and rich history. West Dumbartonshire marked the end of the Antonine Wall, so you had the Roman legions living and operating in this area, building hill forts and baths and so on. You also have the famous Dumbarton Castle, which is the most ancient, continuously fortified place in the whole British Isles. Vikings and all sorts have tried to capture the fortress over the centuries, and it remains a magical place to visit if you're ever in the area. Of course, with such a lengthy history, you're bound to have a few strange and even paranormal stories attached to the area, and that's what I want to cover today on this third episode of Mysterious Events. We'll start with the famous castle. Dumbarton Rock has a recorded history dating back over 1500 years, but was undoubtedly used as a fortress for millennia before that, protecting the surrounding area from invaders sailing up the River Clyde and providing a base for the kings of what would eventually become Strathclyde. My own historical novel, The Druid, is set in 430 AD, when the Romans have just deserted Britain, and its hero, the giant warrior druid Bellicus, hails from Dumbarton. Where better? Built on a volcanic plug 240 feet high, with over 360 steps to the highest of two summits, this site is an obvious place for magic and history to come together. There's only one entrance, through an imposing gatehouse which leads you into the Governor's House, with its tickets office, up the many stairs past the guardhouse, French prison and well, then up again to either of the two summits for fantastic views of the Clyde and the surrounding area for miles around. As you might expect of such an ancient and nowadays rather quiet site, there's no shortage of ghost stories. I worked as a steward in the castle about 20 years ago, hearing and recording many of those tales. I also experienced some unexplained and frightening phenomena myself. The most frequently cited spectre, at that time at least, was a 6-foot tall, kilted Scotsman with a bright white shirt and flame red hair, who, according to one surprised tourist, was very attractive. Two psychic mediums claimed this handsome ghost, who wears a modern style kilt rather than the ancient belted plaid, and seems to my mind like something from the cover of a romance novel, was called Brian. Brian has been seen frequently over the years, usually on the stairs leading up to the guardhouse, as has an enigmatic grey lady who, on the first snowfall of winter, walks solemnly around the grounds dressed in Victorian garb. Nearby Overtoun House is apparently haunted by a similar grey or white lady. Maybe it's the same one. If so, she's certainly picked two of the area's most scenic spots to spend the afterlife, but we'll get to her later. More bizarrely, members of the neighbouring bowling club were interrupted one afternoon by a ghostly soldier who walked through the castle wall and onto the green in the middle of a game, before disappearing in front of the shocked bowlers. I was told this by a man who saw it happening with his own eyes, so it's a fantastic first-hand account, although, in all honesty, the lenses of his spectacles were as thick as my thumb. I don't doubt his honesty, but perhaps his eyesight made this particular account more spectacular than it really was. If we carry on up the many stairs, we come to the French prison, named for its use in holding captured French soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. A local psychic claimed to see 3 men in this building, including one covered in cuts and with his lower arm missing. I assume that means his hand. Despite the fact this building was locked to the public when I worked on the site, any time we did a routine check, once a month or so, the dusty old floors seemed to have been freshly swept by some unknown cleaner who had moved the brush from one room to another. A little girl has also occasionally been seen at the windows of this locked building, which is totally incongruous given the historical absence of children in this building, and incredibly eerie as a result. Atop the eastern summit is the Powder magazine. This is a small single-room building with nothing but old barrels in it. There's a motion sensor which switches the lights on when someone comes in, and even when no visitors were on site, the stewards often found the lights inexplicably switched on, as if someone had come inside. A young tourist was visibly shaken when he told me of his account of hearing a woman's voice saying "greetings" as he entered the small building. This man was so upset he even phoned the stewards the next day to make sure no one had been playing a trick on him. Needless to say, we hadn't. Whose voice had he heard so clearly? Did the wind carry some other visitor's words across the summits to him? Was someone playing a trick, or was it a playful spirit? I can remember that guy quite clearly. He was convinced that we must have had some electronic equipment up there that played a recording that said "greetings," but there was nothing like that in there, so that remains a mystery, but his fear was very real as he was talking to me. The most active building is the Governor's House, which is no surprise as it contains the gift shop and the custodian's living quarters, and is inhabited much of the time. Members of staff alone in the building after locking up at night have heard voices calling their names. Doors have locked and opened themselves of their own accord, and loud knocking is heard frequently on the kitchen door. That happened when I was there actually. I don't think it happened to me. I don't remember it happening to me, and I'm sure I would have written it down, but it definitely happened to the other steward. I remember her telling me. The burglar alarm on the site was even heard switching itself off one night, as if someone was inside the building punching in the code. This was impossible. All keys were accounted for, and no one had been inside when the place was locked up for the evening. It would have set the alarm off anyway, the motion sensors. This event genuinely defied explanation, even by the alarm company who were contacted for their advice, and it badly frightened the custodian. There are some locked glass cabinets in one of the rooms, with various items on display. More than once some of these things changed position when the whole place was locked down and uninhabited. One little tin in particular would turn around overnight, apparently of its own accord, while everything around it remained in position, and we would come in the next day and it would have inexplicably moved around while the room was locked and the case was locked. It was really bizarre. Even more disturbingly, on 2 separate occasions, female guests staying in the custodian's house overnight were woken by the figure of a man telling them to get out, with one woman being physically dragged out of the bed. Of course, no man was found within the building on subsequent anxious investigation. I myself experienced 2 frightening events. Once, as I locked up, all alone in the Governor's house, I very distinctly heard loud footsteps directly behind me on the stone floor, even though no one was there. This made shivers run down my back, and it really did scare me quite badly. Another time after locking up, I was outside by the wall, awaiting the custodian who I was going to drive to the local shops, when I again heard loud footsteps coming down the stairs behind me. I assumed it was my colleague, but no one appeared. When the custodian came down a few minutes later, I told her about it, and she told me the very same thing had happened to her at the same time of day, in the same place. She had been so frightened by it, she fell down the steps and broke her wrist. And I remember her having that broken wrist, but she never told me until then how it had happened. While I was working there, a psychic medium visited with a journalist from a well-known newspaper. This guy had been on TV, and he was something of a celebrity at the time, so I was really intrigued to see if he came up with anything. This was back in the days of Most Haunted and things like that being on UK television and quite a big thing. So this medium went round the castle trying to sense the ghosts, but to be quite honest, he must have been having an off day, or his spirit guide was down the pub, because he came up with absolutely nothing. I distinctly remember that medium quite aggressively trying to get me to tell him the ghost stories attached to the castle, obviously so he could use it in the newspaper piece as if he'd psychically divined it all himself. Unfortunately for him, I was intending to write an article about the ghostly tales for a magazine, which I eventually did. So I refused to just give away all the information I'd worked hard to collect, just so he could take the credit for it. He went away pretty pissed off at me, but it's not my fault his psychic powers failed him that day. Probably the scariest event that happened to me when I worked at the castle, I think it happened on a Saturday. There was actually another floor above the ticket office. This floor was always locked off, nobody was ever in it, apart from on a Sunday when we opened it for a few hours to the public. This, as I say, was a Saturday, I'm sure. Definitely wasn't a Sunday anyway. And this floor was locked off. Even the custodian never went into this floor because her house was in the floor above that again. So this was in the middle floor that I'm talking about. It was all locked off, and we were in the ticket office. People were coming in, visitors were coming in and so on. It was just a normal day when we suddenly started hearing thumps from this floor above us. And it was as if somebody was walking on the floor. And obviously all three of the staff knew the ghost stories. So we were looking at one another like, my God, what the hell's happening here? We know there's nobody up there, it's all locked off, we're the only ones with the keys. It must be a ghost. So we tried to ignore it for a while, thinking, well, if it is a ghost, they can carry on and do what they like. But eventually it went on so much that it became clear that it was our duty to check it out. And with me being the man, that duty fell to me, even though I was probably the most frightened out of all of us. So I got the key and I opened the door. Nobody came with me actually, thanks very much you two. And I went wandering up. I must admit I was absolutely petrified. I honestly thought I was going to see some kind of ghost or demon or something. And I walked up the stairs and I looked into, there's a big long drawing room with a big table. And that's where the noises were coming from. And there facing me was a guy who we'd call a Ned in Scotland. A guy about 20 odd, and a girl. And they were sitting with cans of Tennant's Lager, drinking them. And I was so astonished that I was no longer frightened because I knew it wasn't a ghost, it was just some young guy and his girlfriend. But I was amazed because I couldn't figure out how they get in. I says to him, "What the hell are you doing in here? How did you get in?" And his explanation was that he'd found a key lying outside. And he'd used it to open the door. There was a door in from outside. And he'd used it and he'd come inside and just happened to have cans of beer with him, this girl. And I mean, it was so utterly bizarre and I kicked them out. I told them they had to leave, and they did. There was no trouble or anything. And they went away, and none of us knew who the hell they were, how they'd get a key, how we'd known what the key fitted, what door it fitted. And it was incredible actually. We ended up having a right good laugh about it. But it was so strange. Dumbarton Castle has played host to many great adventures and historical figures over the centuries, including Mary Queen of Scots, Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, and now in my novels, Bellicus the Warrior Druid. Check them out, starting with the Druid. All are free worldwide with Kindle Unlimited. Now, after that shameless plug, we'll just move a short distance along the A82 dual carriageway and up past Milton to end up at another beautiful historical building, Overtoun House. And this is actually the cover for the Mysterious Events thumbnail that you see on the header on YouTube. That big house, that's Overtoun House. There's a very good chance you'll have heard of this place if you're a fan of podcasts like this, as there's a now infamous bridge which has become known worldwide as the Dog Suicide Bridge. It's a very sinister name for what is a very serene and beautiful place. My gran used to take me walking up there before I was old enough to start school, and all throughout my life I've walked my own dogs there, and even taken my kids up to gather holly and ivy for our traditional Christmas wreath. The so-called dog suicide bridge was not something locals ever spoke about until relatively recently, as far as I'm aware. My mum grew up in the village and had never even heard of this weird legend until the past 10 or 20 years or so, same as me. Neither of us can remember any stories of dogs jumping over the side of the bridge to their deaths. But the tale started to be reported and kinda went viral, so even podcasts like Astonishing Legends in the USA have spoken about it. Essentially, what happens is that people will be happily walking their dogs across the bridge when, for no apparent reason, the animal will just jump over the side and crash to their doom below. Sometimes they survive and are badly injured, sometimes they die. It's a very long fall. But there never seems to be any reason for why the dogs jump. In terms of numbers, apparently up to 50 dogs have died over the years, and some tabloids report that at about 600. 600 have supposedly jumped over the bridge. Now, apparently this all started back in the 1950s, when locals started to call the place the Bridge of Death, or the Dog Suicide Bridge. But as I say, I've lived in the village, as have most of my family, going right back to my great-grandfather, and as far as I'm aware, none of us remember any of that. It won't shock you to know that there doesn't seem to be a single verified source for the numbers given in the tabloids. Who's counting these dog suicides? Who would you report it to if your dog died like that? I doubt the police would be interested or keep records. So as far as I can tell, the numbers given are hearsay at best, and plain made up at worst. The Wikipedia article says the suicides ramped up after the year 2000, so let's be charitable and say most of the events happened since then. If you divide 24 years by 600 dogs, that means 25 dogs every year. Every year are jumping over that bridge to their doom, or about 2 every single month. Does that really sound credible? It sounds ludicrous to me, and I still walk my own dog over the bridge without fear to this day. Although admittedly she's so small she couldn't possibly manage it over the wall. So much for the inflated figures, but there are verified accounts of dogs jumping to their deaths, and I'll link to them in the show notes. I won't read them all out because it's pretty depressing, but they prove that the phenomenon is not a complete fabrication of the newspapers. Something is causing these dogs to jump over the wall and die or suffer injuries. In the Daily Record, Alice Trevorrow reported this about her 3-year-old spaniel. She loves her ball and is normally looking at me, waiting for it, so it was very uncharacteristic. She turned her head, looked up and did this massive leap. I will never forget the awful whine she made as she jumped over. My son looked down and all I could see was a dot. She managed to get herself up and met my son, collapsing when she saw him. How she survived that I'll never know. Then in the Daily Express, Kenneth Meikle said, I was walking with the kids and the dog Hendrix when suddenly he jumped off the bridge. My daughter screamed and I ran down to the river to pick her up. The next day the vet saved it. Hendrix was lucky because it fell in a thick patch of moss. I was struck by the guy calling his dog It here, but maybe he was just looking after Hendrix and it wasn't his. It did seem a strange turn of phrase. But dogs do sometimes jump over the bridge, as we can see from those reports. But why? This is a big question. Some claim there's animals such as mink or pine martens in the undergrowth below the bridge, and the dogs smell them. The wall on the bridge comes up to about my hips, so basically a dog can't see over. They cannot tell how high up they are. I assume they think the other side of the wall is the same height as the ground they're standing on. So the dogs smell the pine martens, jump over the wall to chase them, and get the shock of their lives when they realise the other side is actually a 50-foot drop. Honestly, I look over that wall myself and it gives me shivers. It's such a long way down. Check the show notes for links to photos I've taken myself. They'll give you an idea of just what I'm talking about and why the dogs could easily get confused. Of course, there's plenty of people who think the dogs are jumping to their deaths because of some supernatural reason. On the How Stuff Works website they say, "Still, this part of the country is full of superstitious folks." Well, I can assure you, people here are no more superstitious than anywhere else in the world, and much less so than many countries. As an example, just an aside here, I was once part of a UFO group, and I volunteered to become an investigator for them in the Glasgow area. I was the lead investigator for a few years, and you know how many UFO reports come in from Scotland's biggest city to us in all that time? Literally zero. People in these parts are more likely to take the piss out of you if you claim to have seen a ghost or a UFO. So for that reason, I'm more inclined to take reports of paranormal phenomena seriously if they're from my area, and that most definitely includes Overtoun, because the house beside the dog suicide bridge is said to be haunted by a white lady. Now this is a story I remember being told over the years I was living nearby, although I never met anyone who'd personally seen the ghost. She's said to be the wife of the original owner of Overtoun House, her spirit haunting the place after she received the traumatic news that her husband had died. Maybe her ghost is the one causing the dogs to jump over the bridge. I've seen that suggested. There is one very dark event recorded at the bridge, and I apologise in advance for including it. But a schizophrenic man threw his own baby off the bridge in 1994, convinced the child was the Antichrist. I remember reading a book about the Dyatlov Pass incident, in which some hugely experienced Russian hikers died in very mysterious circumstances. The author, Donny Ikar, suggested that infrasound had somehow terrified the hikers, making them abandon their tents in the middle of a snowstorm and die in various bizarre ways. It's a really interesting story, you should definitely check that one out. Similarly, there's a theory that Vic Tandy came up with, that infrasound was making people think his laboratory was haunted. He managed to prove his theory scientifically, and you can find out more at the links in the show notes. Stories like that, about Tandy's haunted lab and the Dyatlov Pass, make you wonder if somewhere like Overtoun Bridge is also the epicentre of some infrasound vortex, where, under certain conditions, maybe when the wind blows beneath the bridge at certain angles, that it can affect the minds of dogs and even people, and cause them to become temporarily insane. Personally, I've always viewed Overtoun as a beautiful place to walk and spend time. My most recent visit to the place saw me taking my son up in the snow to play on his sledge. I've never seen anything weird myself, even though when I was a meter reader I had to go down into Overtoun House's dark windowless cellar to check their electric meter. Nothing scary happened, unfortunately, but I do have one story from someone who personally experienced a mysterious event in Overtoun. A guy I used to work with, Big Davey we'll call him, told me that he'd been rambling on the estate with a few of his friends when they saw a UFO. He was not the type of guy to make up a story like this, and he told me it in earnest, so I was left with the impression he had genuinely seen something he couldn't explain, and it genuinely frightened him. Full disclosure, I believe he and his friends had been on the beer all day, and usually that's used as an excuse to explain away reports of supernatural phenomena. But I don't know about you, I've been drunk once or twice in my life, and I've never hallucinated a UFO or anything else. Blaming the beer for paranormal sightings is a pretty shit excuse if you ask me, although I must admit it's quite possible Big Davey and his mates just saw an aircraft and mistook it for a UFO. It was before the days of mobile phones, so they never took any pictures, although any time I've tried to take a photo of distant objects in the sky, they just come out like little black dots or a crappy wee blur, so even a picture would likely not have solved the case of Big Davey's UFO. So circling back to the dog suicide bridge, what do you think is causing dogs to jump from there? Does the explanation lie with the paranormal? Perhaps a ghostly white lady frightening or even enticing the hounds to throw themselves to their doom? Or does the answer lie in some hitherto unexplored area of science, such as an infrasound vortex swirling around the bridge at certain times of the year when the conditions are just right, or wrong in this case? Or is it simply the smell of mink or pine martens, combined with the design of the bridge's wall, making the dogs think the jump is smaller and safer than it really is? I'm not sure if we'll ever know for sure, but if the numbers are anywhere near as high as the tabloid newspapers suggest, I'd love to know why a fence hasn't been put up to stop the dogs jumping over. It might be an eyesore, but better that than all those dead pets, surely. I did contact the current custodians of Overtoun House to ask them that, but they never replied, so I guess that's that. I have a couple of other strange tales from the Dumbarton area to share as well. Not as long or as detailed as the dog suicide bridge, but interesting nonetheless. The Denny Tank Maritime Museum opened in 1883, and it's another place I used to go in and read the electric meter. It's a long, narrow building with a water tank that was used to test ship designs using models, and it's said to be haunted by one of the Denny brothers who built the place. The main entrance and cafe is at one end. At the other end it's dark and gloomy and there's no one there, but guess where the electric meter is located? I used to have to go along there myself every month, wearing a life vest in case I fell into the water tank, and read the meter in a little enclosed room. I must admit I never saw or heard anything weird, but I used to bloody hate going along there some days. There'd be a weird depressive atmosphere, and I'd practically run to the electric meter and back. I always just assumed it was down to me being a big baby, but then I read that it was apparently haunted, so maybe it wasn't just my own cowardice at play. When I was a meter reader I used to meet loads of interesting people, and there was one guy, a security guard, we'll call him Jim, who was from Dumbarton, but he worked in a vacant building in Clydebank. Again, that was one of the electric meters I read every month for years, and we got talking one day about ghosts. He said the empty building he guarded was fine. I used to catch him sleeping in it actually, he was so relaxed in the place. Lazy bastard. But he told me of a terrifying encounter he'd had as a child. Jim was about 65 when I was talking to him, and his tale took place when he was in his early teens, so I'd guess probably around mid to late 1960s. He was walking up from the River Leven in Bon Hill, West Dumbartonshire, towards what is now Dillichip Park. I've linked the location in the show notes if you want to have a look, and I'll put up some photos on my Facebook and X pages. It was dark this night, and teenage Jim was with his father. They saw a man approaching them, who seemed to have appeared from nowhere, and as he came closer, Jim started to panic because he realised he could see right through this guy's body. Poor Jim basically shat his pants and ran off, leaving his father behind to face the apparition himself. I don't know what happened after that, in terms of what his father did or saw, but Jim told me he'd never been so frightened in all his life, either before or since that event. I've tried to find out if anyone else has ever experienced anything paranormal at that location, but I can't find anything. I visited today to take some photos and there was an old man out in his garden right at that spot. I thought it would be a great opportunity to do some first-hand research, so I asked him if he'd ever heard of any ghosts haunting the area beside his house, but disappointingly he had not, and he didn't seem interested in talking to me either. Just got one of those faces maybe. Me, I mean, no him. Jeez, he's listening to this. A girl was murdered on the other side of the road in the 1990s, which I hadn't realised until now. That was another terrible crime that still upsets people in this area, so I'll leave it there. When I started thinking about doing this episode, there was one really great story I wanted to include. Unfortunately, I cannot find anything about it online. This goes back to my first job, when I worked as a forklift driver amongst other things at a Diageo factory in Dumbarton. We bottled Giant Bee whiskey, Smirnoff vodka, Archer's peach schnapps and Malibu, and there was a guy there with the surname Hamilton, and he came from a place called Dalmuir, which is just up the road from Dumbarton. This guy had actually been in the newspapers because his house was haunted by a poltergeist. He didn't make a secret of it, but he didn't make a big deal of it either because, as you can imagine, in a factory full of Scotsmen and women, he took a bit of stick for this haunting. I remember asking him about his experiences though, and he was deadly serious as he told me he had not made it up. His house really had been turned upside down by a poltergeist and had made his family's life absolute hell. As I say, it had been reported in some newspapers, which is why my co-workers knew about it, but I've been unable to locate those old reports. Which is a shame, as poltergeist stories are incredibly rare in Scotland, and I'd love to find out some of the details of that guy's haunting. Years later, I was sent to his street to read the meters, and when I realised where I was, I planned to ask him to really fill me in on it, but he wasn't home and I've never seen him again. There was a funny element to the whole story. As I said, his surname was Hamilton, and one of the guys in the whisky factory dubbed him Halloween Hamilton, thanks to the spooky story. I thought that was a hilarious nickname, and everyone ended up calling the poor guy that, which probably gives you an idea of why there's hardly any poltergeists reported in Scotland. Halloween Hamilton. Brilliant. If you hear this, Mr. Hamilton, and want to let us know about your story, please get in touch. There's a couple of other tales from this area that you can find if you look for them. Well, I don't have personal experience of any of these. The first one, it comes from Cardross, and a place called Laura's Cafe. There's apparently a poltergeist haunted the place there around about 2011, and it was nicknamed Nanny Goonie by locals. And it was said to move items around at night, pull pictures off walls, and put crumbs of food on recently cleaned tables. Nanny Goonie. I don't know what that name's supposed to mean. A goonie could be a gown, so it maybe just means lady in a gown or something like that. I don't know. Not familiar with this. And the next one, a shaggy creature in the Vale of Leven Woodland near Tullycune Castle. This was about 1991, so you're going back a fair way here for this. 2 teenagers saw a shaggy creature over 3 metres tall, covered in black hair as they hunted rabbits in the area. Usually you go hunting with a dog, don't you? So, I don't know if they had a dog with them. I wonder how that reacted. There's no mention of it in this wee report here. But one witness said the creature had white eyes but no pupils. So 3 metres tall, covered in black hair, and with completely white eyes. Now that would freak anybody out. After watching the creature for what felt like a minute, both witnesses fled. I don't blame them. And those both came from the paranormal database, which I'll link in the show notes as well. One other one they've included here, although it's not from Dumbarton, it isn't part of the Antonine Wall at Bar Hill Fort, which is a bit further along to the east from Dumbarton. I'm not really sure why they've included it here, but I might as well read it because it's quite interesting. It says, while picnicking with her daughter, this witness heard a stampede of horses close by, but no animals could be seen. This was in 2004. This is interesting because it's an old Roman hill fort on the Antonine Wall, so they would have had their horses regularly exercising and on manoeuvres and stuff back in the day. And you wonder if that's what she's picked up on. Then again, it could just have been a noise echoing from somewhere else on the top of one of these small hills. Sounds can carry from miles away and it can seem like it's right next to you, so who knows what's happened there. Well, that's it for this episode of Mysterious Events. If you're enjoying the show and you'd like to support us with the running costs, you can buy me a coffee at the link in the show notes. If you'd like to hear more from me while you wait for the next episode, check out Rock Paper Swords, the historical action and adventure podcast that I co-host with best-selling author Matthew Harvey. The link is in the show notes. We've interviewed amazing guests like Ben Kane, Robin Warder from The Trail Went Cold, and even rock stars like Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson and Todd Dammit Kearns from Slash's band, so there's loads to dive into. Cheers all, and until next time, seek the mysteries. and my most recent visit to the place saw me taking my son up in the snow to play on his head. Shite.